So today's class, basically, we're going to be looking at 7 reasons why strategies fail, and these 7 reasons could easily affect your attempt to put in place an appropriate strategy, a fundraising and financing strategy for your organization. And by research, it's observed that close to 70% of design strategies for various organizations at various levels fail, and some of them are not even implementable for that matter. But we want to see a situation where we put our best foot forward, and then we are able, to put in place strategies that are adequate, strategies that are implementable, strategies that are well researched, strategies that are well understood and communicated to stakeholders, strategies that are well monitored and evaluated over the period of time. Now, the first reason why strategies fail is due to what we consider to be incompetent management. Now, inadequate capabilities of top management, particularly program and project managers in non-profit and social enterprise organizations, are a common cause of strategy implementation failure. Without competent organizational members, implementing a strategy successfully becomes very difficult, if not even impossible. That speaks straight to the point that with a properly designed strategy in place, we'll still need adequate management to be able to translate that and bring about the attainment of your goals through well executed strategy. It's important to fill management space and fill staff space in the organizations with competent individuals. It's purely a HRO function, but as much as is possible, it's incumbent on the organization as a whole to ensure that your non-profit employs only people who are competent and can do and deliver on the mandates given to them on their jobs. Now, organizational members with implementation responsibilities need to have sufficient skills and knowledge to implement the strategy. Eventually, organizational members are the ones who have to perform the implementation activities to make the strategy a success. So basically, especially having competent management, in non-profit and social enterprise organizations is important, quite important. When top management is incompetent, the whole organization is affected, and the strategy implementation effort, goes out of gear, basically. And furthermore, when employees have little confidence in the ability of management to execute, the design strategy, then their own commitment to the strategy, will begin, to flounder and, virtually become low. So we're looking at a situation where, with competent management in place, it, has a way of affecting every other part of the organization. And having incompetent members within a team can also negatively influence the performance of other organizational members. So watch out for this. HRO, it's your job to take note of this. Well-performing organizational members have their motivation reduced, generally when they have to work with poor-performing colleagues, generally. Especially the presence of incompetent managers. This usually has a very negative influence on the performance of subordinates. Now, if a person is competent and that person's manager is not, this is likely to have a negative influence on the level of motivation and implementation performance in your non-profit. So these are issues to look out for, and note that successful organizational members tend to leave an organization when they have to work with incompetent managers and feel that their performance is not appreciated or even worked against. A lot of organizations, the attrition rate in quite a couple of them is quite, sometimes can be regarded as high. if you care to find out the reasons, in some instances, it has to do with, lower level staff, who don't have, faith or confidence in the top management. So to increase the level of competence of organizational members, several practices can be used, such as training and education, coaching and counseling, giving feedback generally about performance, and addressing poor performance, very quickly, hiring and firing of organizational members and bringing in external expertise. Quite a couple of times, if it's well managed, external consultants have a lot to do in making the process to become, solid, especially where the strategy plans, have been designed and they are functional in nature. All right. Now, the second reason why sometimes our fundraising strategies and our financing strategies fail is because our strategic vision, could be vague. You see, successful strategy formulation and implementation begins with formulating a sound and clear strategic vision by the top management of the non-profit and social enterprise organization. Now, a strategic vision describes the desired future state of the organization. It becomes a beacon, it becomes a lighthouse towards which the entire organization gravitates. So it has to be clear, it should not be vague. And then the strategic vision helps clarify the direction in which an organization is to move. A clear and well-formulated strategic vision is a key requirement for organizational redesign. So basically, the strategic vision, constantly, clarifies the direction in which the organization is to move or it's going. So it's essential at this point to have a very clear strategic vision. So without a clear strategic vision, the chances that the strategy plan itself will not be actionable, will not be implementable, is very, very high, due to the fact that the members of staff cannot relate with a vague vision. So without a clear strategic vision, organizational members and other stakeholders lack a clear direction for the new strategy. And managers and employees need to know that they have to achieve with respect to the strategy implementation. Therefore, the strategic vision needs to be clearly defined and well formulated. In addition, the strategic vision needs to be attractive and easy to communicate towards organizational members, customers, shareholders, and other relevant stakeholders. The simpler the strategic vision is, the easier it is to understand and execute for organizational members. And a clear and attractive strategic vision increases the confidence of employees in a successful outcome of a strategy implementation effort. As soon as the members of the organization identify with a clear strategic vision, implementation becomes run-of-the-mill. All right. So, class, we have to put these things into consideration as we begin to sit down to design fundraising and financing strategies. We also have to take note of the fact that an attractive, new strategic vision can help to attract and unite organizational members and stimulate them to increase their effort. However, not only must the vision be clear and attractive, it must also be realistic and feasible. An unrealistic strategic vision reduces the motivation and commitment of organizational members. These, are very salient points that we must take and put into consideration when formulating our strategic vision. And please note that if a particular vision is found to not to be functional or workable, it will be a wise decision to redraft that vision. All right. Now, the third reason why strategies fail will be an inadequate strategy. Now, no implementation can save a strategy which is not feasible or sound to begin with. We just talked about, a feasible vision, a few minutes ago. Now, a failure to think through the strategy makes it impossible to implement, except by chance. I just want to repeat that. That a failure to think through the strategy makes it impossible to implement, except by chance. And an unclear strategy and conflicting priorities are definitely barriers to successful strategy implementation in a non-profit and a social enterprise organization like yours. And furthermore, organizations also not only needs their strategies to be sound and feasible, but we also need it to be clear. So organization members who have to implement the strategy need to have a clear understanding of the strategy. Here we are talking about the strategy itself. Previously we talked about the vision, but now we're talking about the strategy itself. So organizational members need to understand what the operational objectives of the strategy implementation are and what the consequences are for them as individuals. All right. So furthermore, we can say organizational members need to know what to do to make the strategy a success. Consequently, a strategy needs to be simple and focus on the essence of the strategy. When a strategy is clear and simple, it is easier to understand, for organizational members. So making the strategy clearly understandable helps a great deal. So your strategy can fail if the strategy itself is not understandable or it's equally vague. Now, however, managers and executives usually have a tendency to keep the strategy rather vague, allowing them to avoid criticism when the strategy proves unsuccessful. This is always observable, especially in institutions that do not use painstaking means, and I would say who do not follow the proper procedure in drawing up strategies for the organizations. It comes out, vague, and everybody begins to pass the buck, because quite a couple of activities sometimes might not be actionable, or we don't know the officers responsible for doing certain rules, in the fundraising and in the financing. It now becomes a maze of confusion, and the result, of course, of that is that quite a couple of the staff members begin to resent management. Okay, so vague strategies are often a natural outcome of policy making processes in the public sector, and strategies and policies are often developed in a way that reduces the level of clarity of the strategy or policy and makes implementation problematic. Now, this is a common problem, especially in government circles, in the public sector, where strategies, sometimes, if they exist at all, they are vague, and these are a consequence of the poor policy making processes in the public sector. So when these strategies and policies are developed in a way that reduce the level of clarity of the strategy or policy, then it makes implementation problematic. It makes it problematic. So unlike private firms, public organizations tend to be controlled by bodies that consist of multiple and competing interests. Now, the controlling body tends to consist of policymakers who often have different agendas and who are designed to benefit their own constituents, but not necessarily those of others in the controlling group. Therefore, there is a need to create coalitions between multiple and often competing objectives in order to agree on a certain policy. A common method of securing policy support is to increase the ambiguity of a proposed policy. A usual observation of the entire policy making processes in the public space, and that I mean in the public sector, would immediately give us an indication that sometimes difficult issues are often more or less left unresolved and not specified in sufficient terms. So these in itself require subsequent interpretation, legal interpretation and the rest of it. So how does this affect our drafting or our design of functional fundraising and financing strategies for the non-profit social enterprise organizations, public, bodies. It gives us a very clear understanding that the policy ambiguity, normally allows different groups and individuals to support the same policy, for different reasons and with different expectations, sometimes including different expectations about the administrative consequences of the policy. So this makes official policy to become vague, contradictory, sometimes, and these are adopted without generally shared expectations about their meanings and implementation. Now, these are, the kind of pitfalls you experience when you're trying to do internal strategy, because you are in an environment that is affected, by a wide range of stakeholders on the one hand, and then, of course, you are in an enabling environment which is overseen by government policies, but sometimes they have a way of, dripping into your strategy formulation. And most importantly, as it has to do with fundraising and financing, this of course sometimes is affected by government fiscal policy, and to an extent even the monetary policy of the various countries sometimes come into play when strategy for financing and fundraising is being put in place, because the policies that oversee various sectors sometimes can be ambiguous. Now, the lack of clarity allows policymakers to show their constituents that they have successfully represented their interests, but in this way the ambiguity of a policy increases the chance of its adoption, but at the cost of creating administrative complications. Thus, policy ambiguity is less the result of deficiencies of policymakers than a natural consequence of gaining the required support for the policy, or of changing preferences over time. We need to be very careful in how we marry our how we design our fundraising and financing strategies, because we are not operating in an island. You're operating in a cross-section of society, which influences what you do at one time or the other. So cross-check with the relevant government policies, maybe administrative policies or county policies, to know exactly if your strategy is also in line with what they prescribe. All right. Now, another reason why strategies fail is when there is a lack of implementation plan. This in itself, I believe, so much is a HRO issue. It's a HRO, more or less, it falls within the HRO department to take care of. It's important to note that a sound policy might not have an implementation plan. An implementation plan, of course, after the strategy is developed, it needs to be translated into a concrete and well worked out implementation plan. Now, is a fundraising and financing strategic plan cannot be executed when it is not translated into operational terms. So even the best strategy is worthless when managers cannot translate the strategy into operational reality. So it's crucial that the strategy implementation plan specifies activities, processes, and operational objectives that are required to achieve the goals of the strategy. The strategic objectives need to be translated into measurable operational implementation, sub-objectives, and linked to departmental and individual goals. It's very crucial for that, to be in place, to make our plans implementable and to also make them actionable. So the measurable objectives, which provide an effective basis, they do provide an effective basis for management control of the implementation. Please take note of that we need measurable objectives which will provide an effective basis for management control of the implementation. Now, a lack of clear strategy objectives contributes to strategy implementation failure. Again, I will say that a lack of clear strategy objectives contributes, to strategy implementation failure. So your strategy objectives must be clear enough. Your objectives must be smart, and put in the proper frame of words that your stakeholders can also understand. Now, if you lack proper and clear fundraising and financing strategy objectives, you are likely to have a strategy implementation failure. So we should look at this closely and understand that without concrete objectives and milestones, it's impossible to measure, the progress of the strategy implementation, and this makes managing and improving the strategy implementation impossible, totally impossible. So therefore, the implementation plan needs to contain a clear set of concrete and measurable objectives or targets. This also falls under, regular monitoring and evaluation processes. So your clear and specific tasks needs to be defined, which are more or less required to achieve these targets. So everyone with strategy implementation responsibilities needs to know what to do in order to, virtually implement the strategy, and what concrete objectives they have to attain. So unclear objectives leave room for, differential interpretation and discretion, and may thus contribute, very largely and essentially to implementation failure. Furthermore, effective strategy implementation requires, clear implementation tasks, activities, and responsibilities. The implementation can only be successful when there is a clear and shared understanding of who does what, when, and at what cost. So, and this, necessarily will be reflected in a successful designed fundraising and financing strategy plan. So not only should the necessary actions to implement the strategy be identified and planned, responsibility for these actions, should be allocated as well. By allocating clear responsibilities for the execution of the implementation activities, progress can be managed and of course controlled. And as we saw earlier, executives and managers, have a tendency to keep a strategy, sometimes rather vague and ambiguous. Such an approach also has its advantages, as plans are by their nature designed to promote inflexibility. However, vague strategies also lead to vague strategic objectives, and specific and ambitious but realistic goals which are accepted by organizational members lead to the best task performance. People need realistic challenges to perform well. So let's look at it and say, with smart objectives, with smart goals, we can be specific, we can be ambitious with realistic goals, and it is easier for our organizational members to accept this, and then leads to the best performance ever. Right. Further, when organizational members have decided that it's impossible to reach a goal, they will stop trying to reach that goal. When the goals are unattainable, when the activities are not actionable, there is usually an attrition rate out of the entire processes. That is where sometimes staff fatigue sets in, and they just practically vote with their feet. So now the fifth reason why sometimes fundraising and financing strategy plans do not work is when we have inadequate planning and control. So now many strategy implementations fail because of a lack of monitoring and control. Often an effective planning and control system is missing, and without timely and accurate management information, it is impossible to assess the progress of the strategy implementation effort. So this makes it very important to, virtually assess, the implementation, the effects that the implementation is having, and correct to adjust that strategy or its implementation. Should it, continue to produce negative or unsatisfactory results? So during this strategy implementation, it is required that the strategic goals are translated into operational goals with performance indicators that need to be monitored to assess whether the objectives are being achieved in line or in consonance with the strategic goals and objectives. So it's at this point crucial to understand that without monitoring and evaluation, it's not possible to virtually cut an errant strategy before losses or negative impacts become too costly or damaging. The need for monitoring and evaluation cannot be overemphasized, because that's the only way that projects and programs can be kept on the proper rail and direction. And as strategy implementation plans are designed to change, implementation teams need to regularly meet in well-structured and punctuated sessions to share information, confirm priorities, and make decisions. The strategy implementation plans, could change, based on the dynamics of what your organization, is about, based on the dynamics of what you find in the field when you go, fundraising or seeking financing, for your developmental efforts. So the strategy implementation on its own could also change, just as much as you can also tweak strategy, to respond to the dynamics of your time or of your location. So in this way, management can make adjustments when needed and thus, control the strategy implementation effort. To make these adjustments, it is required, to assign clear responsibilities for the achievement of these targets. And when objectives are not being met, the person or persons responsible, need to be held, accountable. And furthermore, when the goals of the strategic implementation are not being achieved, then it's possible that the assumptions underlying that strategy, they are flawed or obsolete. When this is the case, the strategy just needs to be analyzed to assess whether incremental adjustments will suffice or whether a new strategy altogether is needed. So at a point, you need to make a decision whether to discard the strategy you're using, or you just retweak it to be in consonance with the realities that you face, on the field. Now, many organizations, have accountability problems, which may be the result of a lack of planning, absence of a functional management information system, or the existence of cultural values which do not encourage, holding persons, especially in high positions, accountable. That is, more or less a given situation, in Sub-Sahara Africa. So I think a lot of us can identify with these issues. But when a strategy implementation is finished, it needs to be evaluated. This way, an organization may learn from the implementation, which can benefit future strategy implementations. Just like we said earlier on, that was in the second class. Furthermore, it's important to conclude and evaluate a project so the employees can see what they worked for, or by creating a sense of closure. Now, having talked about that, I want us to just quickly look at the sixth reason why sometimes strategies fail. Why, close to 70% of strategy fails in the corporate world. Now, another issue could be, and the sixth one I propound here, is the neglect of political interests. Sometimes politics and struggles over power and leadership are just a few obstacles that can undermine an implementation effort. Strategy formulation and implementation sometimes inevitably raise questions of power within an organization, and the existence of conflicts and the use of individual and group power needs to be taken into consideration. The very prospect of change sometimes confronts established and entrenched positions, and most of this is actually cultural. More so, if your non-profit or your NGO is operating, especially in the areas of advocacy, behavioral change, and the rest, like you will most regularly come face to face with this reality, where you observe that whenever you bring in behavioral change to communities, it confronts established positions, and this might lead to resistance, to change, no matter how well willing, how well meaning you are, pardon me, to the existential realities of the people in that locality. So resistance to change may lead to passivity toward the strategy, or even sabotage, sometimes within staff members. And managers can overcome resistance to change by involving potential opponents in decision making. This is where stakeholder involvement is key. So you go to a community and you are embarking on certain advocacy work that could also result in behavioral change as an impact over the years. You also need to understand that you must do serious stakeholder consultation. Stakeholder consultation, would help your project to work, and also subsequently your strategy, to also work. So involve potential opponents in your decision making and take their interests seriously and clearly while communicating the new strategy and its, subsequent advantages, to them. The final thing I want to say that could also lead to project failures, will lead to failures of strategy implementation and the rest of it, could actually be a culture of fear. A culture of fear where you have, the existing organizational culture can be an obstacle to strategy implementation. And this culture of fear, we're talking about organizational culture. Sometimes the organization culture can be characterized by fear for making mistakes, responsibility, participation, and change. So these are essential, aspects, of organizational life and organizational culture. The members of staff, the top management, middle management, and lower management, who are crucial to the implementation of, a successfully designed, functional fundraising and financing strategy, for your non-profit or your social enterprise. These levels of staff would necessarily, have to live in a proper organizational culture, where there is more or less, horizontal relationships. There's friendliness, and, staff are coached, rather to, perform better. That in itself will help to ensure that your organization's strategy is not sabotaged. All right. When managers act in authoritarian and punitive ways, subordinates become, reluctant to make mistakes and, they engage in learning behaviors. What the employees, ordinarily, will result to is that they are shaped, by the organizations in which they work. And if the organization has high levels of centralization, formalization, and rigid rules, they may become passive and unable to be creative and exercise initiative on the rare occasions that it's encouraged and rewarded. So we need to build the appropriate organizational culture. Sometimes we hold courses on organizational culture to more or less encourage organizations, to relate horizontally to the extent that staff at all levels are carried along. The different levels of staff are clearly aware of the vision, the mission, the values, the goals, and then the objectives, and of course the activities, of the organizations they belong to. And it must be done in an atmosphere, in a friendly atmosphere. However, to implement a strategy successfully, proactive organizational members are often needed who participate in strategy formulation and implementation. In order to participate, organizational members, need to dare to take initiative, voice their opinion, and not be afraid to make mistakes. So this, again, I say, is a HRO function. When you employ staff, make sure you employ staff that are able to think. Make sure you employ staff, that have readiness to learn. And when you have, a combination of a staff who, thinks expansively, is ready to learn and ready to work, that organization, as soon as it puts its strategy together, you can be sure that, that particular staff or those caliber of staff, would want to ensure that, the strategy is attained to, the goals, the milestones, and all, that is required. So we look towards, HRO, bringing in the appropriate staff, to the organization. So therefore, an empowered and fearless organization culture needs to be created in which, organizational members are able to, make mistakes without being punished for it. More so, when the mistakes are not deliberate. Now, when organizational members believe that well-intentioned interpersonal risks will not be punished, this fosters learning behavior. When organizational members of the organization, believe that well-intentioned interpersonal risks, mistakes will not be punished, it engenders them, to learn, to produce better results in the organization. So basically, the fundamental organizational change, needs to be addressed so that the organization does not operate under a culture of fear, as this, can bring about major uncertainties and can trigger intense emotions such as anxiety. So as a new strategy, it should be accompanied, as a new strategy, sometimes layoffs, can accompany it, and even organizational members may perceive it as a threat to their job, or to sometimes even lower job satisfaction. If there is that inclination, thought, or thinking in the hearts of members of staff, sometimes it could lower the organizational commitment and lower job involvement, and this could also have increased psychological withdrawal, greater resistance to change, greater propensity, to leave the organization, and sometimes lower trust in management, and with withdrawal cognitions and behaviors which include reduced work effort and increased absenteeism, and sometimes, theft. To change an existing organizational culture, several strategies and tactics can be used. First, a very clear vision of the new organizational culture is needed, and the vision needs to clearly describe the new culture and how it differs, from the old culture, and what its advantages are. So it's be expected that in trying to change organizational culture, the new and preferred culture should be compared, to the old one, and so that the differences and the shortcomings in the previous one will also, be addressed. Okay, so this needs to be communicated very clearly to the employees, and cultural change, involves a lot of communication. Another tactics, will be to individually coach and counsel employees. That is where the issue of coaching and sometimes mentoring comes. In organizations that have mentoring and coaching provisions for staff members, usually tend to adhere to strategy more than organizations that don't have, mentoring and coaching. Okay, so this in itself, should include having open discussions with employees, involve employees and give them information about their performance and the new culture that the non-profit is transiting to. You need to be able to do that to provide a very clear understanding of what is required in the new culture. So, providing training and education, especially motivational courses, can also be used to change the organizational culture to a very large extent. And furthermore, visible changes such as new uniforms, new corporate logo can be used to make the culture change more visible and tangible, to organizational members. I mean, sometimes a shift or a change, in brand appearance also does quite a lot to reinvigorate commitment to official issues. Okay, so in addition, hiring employees who have a better fit with the new culture and demoting or letting go of employees who are not able to fit in the new culture are another tactics that can be used to ensure that you are able to more or less attain onto your strategic goals and your strategic objectives. It's no use keeping employees, who don't share in the vision and the mission of the organization of your non-profit, with the goals, the aspirations, and of course, the activities of your non-profit in raising funding and financing. It will be required for you to have, employees who fit, the rules appropriately to enable you, enable your organization to more or less attain to its corporate goals. Yeah. So finally, I want to say that leadership, from top management is crucial in culture change. Top management will need, as a matter of urgency, to serve as, an example of the norms and the values which it wishes to convey to the organization. The top management immediately become the beacons to which other members of staff look up to, to be able to work appropriately in the environment. Now, changing the existing culture of an organization is quite difficult, and sometimes it's a time-consuming process. It may take years to successfully change an existing organizational culture. However, changing habits that have been the same for a very long time, we all know it's not easy, but it's still possible. And I want to say that from what I have seen in my travels, I seem to come to identify with organizations that have more or less a very encouraging, sound and positive organizational culture, and immediately I can relate that to the successes which they chalk in their endeavor or in their areas of core competence across. I just hope that you've been able to pick up quite a lot in this class, as it has to do with the 7 reasons why sometimes your fundraising and financing strategy can fail. If we look closely at this and adhere to the recommendations, I'm very sure that we will be able to do the right thing. Thank you. My name is Reva Ogo, the Chief Executive of Peniel Doxa Consulting, a public management consulting firm. See you in the next class.